On May 7th, 1945, 6.5 years after the start of the bloodiest war in human history, Germany surrendered to the Allied powers, marking the end of the regime's physical and ideological domination. With 75 million people dead, history expected the Allies to enact bloody revenge, as seen with the harsh German sanctions after World War I, mass execution and imprisonment following the Spanish Civil War, and the targeting of women and children after the Anglo-Boer War. While the Allies did float the idea of mass execution, enslavement, or harsh sanctions, the idea was ultimately dropped thanks to American Supreme Court Justice Robert H. Jackson, who strongly advocated for a trial instead. He knew that punishment without trial would take history's eyes off of the atrocities the Third Reich committed and make the Allies look like hypocrites out for blood. The fact is the Allies failed in their responsibility of protecting human rights during the Holocaust, and therefore had the responsibility to set a precedent for protecting future human rights, not just punishing those who violated them. They accomplished this by creating the Nuremberg trials, which empowered the international community to fulfill its responsibility of protecting human rights, so the horrors of the Holocaust would never be repeated. As the location of the most notorious Nazi rallies, Nuremberg seemed a fitting place to serve justice, but this was no small task. This was the first time in history that an international court would successfully try criminals, and there was no clear legal or moral guide on how to do so. The Allies didn't even know if this could be accomplished, because every previous attempt for international justice, such as trials for Napoleon, the Armenian Genocide, and World War I, were all unsuccessful. Despite the earlier failures, the Allies understood the gravity of the situation, and that they had the responsibility to hold these criminals accountable. So on August 8th, 1945, they created the Nuremberg trials. On August 8th, 1945, representatives signed the Charter of the London Agreement, and the Nuremberg trials were established. The London Agreement created the International Military Tribunal, which consisted of judges and prosecutors from the US, UK, France, and the Soviet Union. The London Agreement also created the jurisdiction of the trials, or the crimes that a defendant could be convicted of. It outlined the rights of the defendants, such as the right to a lawyer in a fair trial, and it established the legal framework of the trials, such as the rules of the procedure and how the separate countries would cooperate. The London Agreement established 4 international crimes that would be tried at Nuremberg: crimes against peace, war crimes, crimes against humanity, and the conspiracy to commit these acts. These were groundbreaking for international justice because they marked the first time individuals could be held responsible for violating international law. Crimes against peace is the initiating or waging a war of aggression, which made an act of aggression itself illegal for the first time. War crimes are violations of wartime customs, such as mistreating prisoners and harming civilians. And while the idea of war crimes existed before Nuremberg, it firmly established its illegality. Crimes against humanity are defined as systematic acts causing large-scale human suffering and death, which was the first international protection of human rights. Finally, the crime of conspiracy is the organization of these crimes, and ensures that those coordinating are held accountable, a revolutionary step in punishing high-level perpetrators. For the first time, acts of aggression, war crimes, crimes against humanity, and conspiracy were not merely condemned, but punished in a court of law, enabling the international community to be responsible for protecting human rights. Another monumental step that the London Agreement took for international law was the establishment of the Nuremberg Principles, which clarified what constitutes as an international crime. To summarize what they established, they A. state that anyone who violates international law can be punished for it, including heads of state. B. That if you violate international law at a time and place where it's legal, such as Nazi Germany, you are still guilty. And C. That if you commit a crime against peace, war, humanity, or conspire to do so, you are guilty of an international crime. This is important because before Nuremberg, it was difficult to prosecute someone for breaching international law because there was nothing explicitly stating what international law was and what you have to do to break it. Now that has changed, making the prosecution of criminals exponentially easier, enabling the international community to uphold its responsibility more effectively. The Nuremberg Principles became part of international law in 1948. With the jurisdiction of the trials established, the tribunal picked 6 organizations and 24 of the most powerful Nazis to stand trial. These Nazis included Hermann Göring, who was Hitler's designated successor and head of the Luftwaffe, Joachim von Ribbentrop, foreign minister who facilitated the deportation of Jews, and Ernst Kaltenbrunner, who was responsible for the Gestapo and oversaw the concentration camps. Of the 24 defendants, only 21 stood trial because Robert Ley committed suicide upon being indicted. Gustav Krupp had his trial postponed due to his poor health, and Martin Bormann was tried in absentia because the Allies couldn't locate him. It was discovered that he died trying to flee Berlin in the last days of the war. Between November of 1945 and October of 1946, Nuremberg tried the remaining defendants and organizations. 3 of the accused were acquitted, 7 were imprisoned, and 12 were sentenced to death. Of the 6 organizations on trial, the Leadership Corps, the SS, and the Gestapo were found guilty, and individuals who were part of these organizations were also considered guilty, though their punishment depended on which part of occupied Germany they lived in. Once the trials concluded, it was the responsibility of each of the occupying powers to try the remaining criminals in their respective zones. England, France, and the Soviet Union's trials focused on crimes committed against their citizens or on their soil. The United States' trials, meanwhile, focused on powerful Nazis that hadn't been tried. This was known as the 12 subsequent Nuremberg trials, which tried 177 high-ranking individuals. The most notorious of these trials was the doctors' trial, where the US tried doctors who conducted inhumane human experiments. One revelation of the doctors' trial was the gross lack of legislation protecting patients' rights. To solve this, the United States created the Nuremberg Code, which outlines what ethical human experimentation is. While the Nuremberg Codes haven't officially been adopted into international law, a person can still face serious consequences for violating it, and the codes therefore offer a shield of protection for human rights. Every subsequent international trial had roots in Nuremberg. The Tokyo trials, the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, the International Military Tribunal for the Rwandan Civil War, and the International Criminal Court all followed the same principles as the Nuremberg trials. They all sought to serve justice to individuals responsible for violations of peace, war, humanity, and conspiracy. They all followed the Nuremberg principles, sought to punish high-ranking criminals, and they all did this through an international court. Nuremberg essentially fathered the rules, structure, and execution of every international criminal court. Despite this, some people forget Nuremberg's impact on future international courts due to the space in between them. But these courts may never have existed if not for Nuremberg. Due to the tension caused by the Cold War, there was nearly a 50-year gap between the Nuremberg and Tokyo trials and the next international trial. It wasn't until 1993, in the collapse of Yugoslavia, that international courts were reintroduced. But with the global tensions of that time, it would have been unlikely for the countries to develop an international court if they didn't have Nuremberg as a guide. Therefore, Nuremberg was not only the first international court, but ensured that it wouldn't be the last. International courts are still prominent this very minute, as the International Court of Justice calls out Israel for breaching international law in Gaza. And if it wasn't for Nuremberg, the ICJ and said international laws would not exist. Another modern-day issue that Nuremberg impacts is Donald Trump's proposed military takeover of Gaza, which, as established at Nuremberg, is a war crime and illegal. Therefore, Nuremberg will most likely prevent this violent takeover of Palestine, which would not only violate international law, but a person's right to their homeland. In the aftermath of the atrocities committed in the Second World War, the Allied powers knew they had the responsibility to bring the individuals and organizations responsible for breaching these human rights to justice. They did this through the Nuremberg trials, which had an enormous impact on the development of international law. It created the first 4 crimes that an individual could be tried for. It established what constitutes as a violation of these crimes, and it created a shield of protection for human rights by creating the Nuremberg Code. Because of this, Nuremberg gave the international community the ability to exercise their responsibility of protecting human rights and holding those who violate them accountable. Thanks to Nuremberg, world peace is possible.